Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 57, and the topic is the latest development in DIDs, and my guest is Marcus Sabadello. Welcome, Marcus.
Hello.
And originally our co-host was Drummond Reed, but for everyone who wanted to see Drummond, I'm sorry, you'll have to catch him at IAW. Drummond is traveling, I think, in China right now and was just not able to make it. But Marcus is one of the gurus and did, so I'm sure we will do fine. And Marcus, before we sort of dive into DIDs, maybe you could give us a quick introduction about your background.
Yeah, sure. I'm also sorry that Drummond is not here, so I'm something like a less fancy backup version of him, or maybe
Everyone
trying to
is,
be.
though, aren't we?
No, so seriously, I'm Marcus Sabadello. I'm founder of a company called Decentralied Tech in Vienna, Austria, and I've been involved in digital identity technologies for a pretty long time, more than 15 years, and always been working on decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity, or what we called user-centric identity a while ago. So always on these kinds of technologies that try to put control over identity, control over data in people's hands without too much centralization. And I've been involved with a lot of standards and communities. I'm contributing to World Wide Web Consortium, different working groups, and also organizations such as DIF, the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And at Decentralied Tech, our company, we are implementing some open source libraries, also commercial products that have to do with decentralized identity technologies and specifically decentralized identifiers, which we will talk about. And I'm also one of the editors of the DIT core specification that I think we'll talk about today.
And it's Danube Tech because you're in Vienna on the Danube, right?
Yes, the Danube River. That's right. That's been the inspiration for the company name in real life. It can be seen as a symbol of interoperability because it's a river that connects many different cities and countries in Europe.
Yeah. So okay, well let me show the title. So the topic today is the latest development in DIDs. A lot is happening in DIDs, and I'm not a DID expert. So maybe we could start sort of. I have a really high level question, but DIDs are a way, they're an identifier for, let's say, a resource or a credential, but web URLs are pretty effective identifiers. What's the reason that URLs weren't, let's say, maybe good enough, and why do we need DIDs and DID documents?
Yeah, I mean that has to do with an ideological movement. I would say that started several years ago around the time when the Snowden revelations happened, and when we all heard about mass surveillance and surveillance capitalism, and data is the new oil, right? And we are not the customer of Facebook, but the product of Facebook. So this entire movement towards decentralization and the self-sovereign identity philosophy, right? The idea to create digital identities that are not dependent on central authorities and intermediaries. That was kind of the ideological and political background. And DIDs as a technology are in a way a technical realization of those ideals, right? DIDs are based on the realization that in order to build self-sovereign identity, to build decentralized identity, you need to have a type of decentralized identifier, right? Because identifiers are the basis for everything else. Without identifiers, we cannot create relationships or connections. We cannot exchange data or messages. We always need ways to address each other, to name things, to people, individuals, and things. And traditional web URLs based on domain names and based on HTTPS were considered not decentralized, right? Because there are central authorities, there are domain name registries, there are root certificate authorities, which contradict a little bit the self-sovereign ideology, because these identifiers are given to you by someone, right? If you use traditional domain name based URLs, then you don't own them, right? Some people think they own a domain name, but you
Great,
cannot
but
own a
I
domain
mean,
name.
maybe to push back on that a little bit, you can register your own domain name. It's actually quite easy and cheap. And then if you want to go one level up, you could actually get your own TLD now. I think it costs $100,000, but if you pay Icon $100K, you can get your own TLD even and set up your own registry. So is the constraint of, yeah, sure, in the context, if you're, renting space in someone else's domain, it's not yours. They could always kick you out or deplatform you. But couldn't you always get your own domain name or even your own TLD?
Well, your own TLD, I'm not sure how many people can afford it, right? Also there are many.
Not in my price budget, but yeah, some
Yeah,
people can.
yeah, some people can, but even then, you're dependent on ICANN, right? And you're dependent on root name servers, and it's just what this self-sovereign or decentralized identity philosophy is all about, right? The idea is that you want identifiers that you can create yourselves, and that a TLD also has to be approved by someone, right? And you can always also lose them. So and these are designed to be as identifiers that you can create yourself, right, without depending on anyone else.
Yeah, and I guess so. Decoupling, let's say, the identifier from the whole internet naming system, um, and I guess this was especially important with the introduction of blockchain technology and people starting to wonder, like, how do I reference something on the blockchain, which doesn't necessarily have an internet name at all? So. Okay, well, I'm sure a lot of our guests already, or our audience rather, already know quite a bit about DIDs. Um, so let's go a little bit deeper. A DID method defines how you get from the DID to the DID document, and there are numerous DID methods over the years. I forget how many, there's dozens, let's say, but I suspect that, if you have the 80-20 rule, that maybe 20% of these methods are probably have the most usage. And I'm wondering if it's maybe even more concentrated than that, or maybe there's a few DID methods that are, let's say, really in use a lot. And as somebody who uses DIDs a little bit, I'm wondering if you could give us some insights into which are the important DID methods to consider. Is that
I have a special guest here. Yeah, so about
Drummond couldn't make it, but even better, we have a real expert on Gen Alpha.
yeah, absolutely. So did methods, yes, you're right. There are many there's a list, and there are many did methods listed, and a lot of them are not really in use, right? And there are certain relatively small number of did methods that are, I would say, significant and that are practically being used. And there's also a standardization of certain did methods going to happen. I'm sorry. And sorry, I'll be right back.
Here's the juggling time. I always joke when we have only one guest, um, we need to juggle. Okay, juggling session ended. Go
Yeah.
on, Mark.
Right, and we've been discussing this topic of did methods in the community a lot. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm going to lock the door. Okay, just 1 second of juggling.
Back to juggling.
Yeah, so we've been discussing this topic in the community, right? We've been discussing, should there be, for example, a certain set of mandatory DID methods that everybody has to implement in order to reach interoperability,
Right.
or
For example, in the browser, like which DID method should if I'm a browser vendor, and DID is a W3C standard, which of those 50 DID methods am I going to implement? Yeah, I could see that being a real question. But what are the hottest? I mean, not to put it sort of in a too poppy context, but what are the hottest DID methods that we should be looking at right now, do you think? Which are the really important ones?
Yeah, I mean, one more comment about this topic, right? The argument is also that if we standardize, let's say, 3 mandatory DID methods, then that again can lead to, is a form of centralization, right? And a lot of people in the community don't like that, and so the idea is that yes, there can be as many DID methods as people want to create, because because those also change over time, right? Originally, the first few DID methods were all based on blockchain, and everybody thought blockchain would be the right technology for DIDs. But that has also evolved and continues to evolve, these thoughts on how decentralized identifiers should be implemented technically, and that's why the DID community has tried to not introduce a governing body or some kind of gatekeeper that would decide what are the good DID methods and what are the bad DID methods. But having said that, yes, there are definitely some DID methods that are more popular and more successful than others. I would mention, for example, DID key and DID JWK. Those are DID methods that are just based on public keys, and in that case, the DID is just a public key. Another DID method, which has always been controversial, is DID web, of course. So the DID web method, in that case, the DID is based on a domain name and the web server, which in a way DIDs have been trying to get away from, right? So there's been a lot of discussion on what decentralization means. And then there are several ledger and blockchain-based DID methods that are being used by real projects with real use cases. So I would mention maybe DID Indie, of course, was an early one. DID Checked is relatively well known. DID Polygon, or that has been renamed at some point, but Polygon-based. There is EPSI, right? So EPSI is the European Blockchain Service Infrastructure. That's a European blockchain project used by all the EU member states for many projects. Then there is DID Ion, which is a little bit in decline right now, so maybe being deprecated, but that has been used quite a bit. And some of the most recent. I'll also mention DID peer, right? That's interesting. A peer-to-peer based DID method, and maybe 2 very recent ones that are getting a lot of attention right now. I would mention DID TDW. This stands for Trust DID Web. So this is a little bit like DID Web, but with several improvements. So DID TDW is an improvement to DID Web. And another one I would mention is DID DHT. That's also relatively new, based on DHT, distributed hash table, that's being used by some projects now. So it's definitely possible to identify some methods that are more used than others. I should also mention DID carry and DID WebS, so DID methods that are based on the carry stack. But there's a lot of diversity.
Yeah, that's actually more than I expected you to list. So we talked a little bit about DIDs, DID documents, DID methods. What's a DID resolver, and why would I need one as a developer?
Well, the DID resolver, that's the thing that looks up the DID document for the DID, right? You mentioned that. That's the essential function which DIDs provide. The DID is the identifier, and it has an associated data structure called the DID document, which contains not personal data, but technical metadata like public keys and some endpoint URLs, and the process of getting from the DID to the DID document. That's DID resolution. And you mentioned already that this depends a lot on the DID method, but the resolver is the thing that provides this, that implements this. Now, a resolver, you should not think of a DID resolver as something that's similar to a domain name resolver, because a DID
Right.
resolver is
So it's
more
not a
something.
DNS service.
Yeah,
Because
so
in
a
the
DID,
DNS service, it returns the actual information. Here's your domain name X, here's your IP address or your service. And so the did resolver doesn't return the credential. It's just returning the metadata about how to resolve this credential, right?
yeah, it returns this technical metadata that then enables interaction, a trusted, secure interaction with the subject that's identified by the DID. But my point is also that a DID resolver is not necessarily a remote service, right? That exposes an API which you have to call, and that's being operated by someone. It's more like a
Okay,
logical component. Sometimes a DID resolver is just a piece of code that runs entirely in a local environment, right? That resolves the
right.
DID just
It
locally, and
could be
that
embedded.
doesn't reach out to any remote service. That can also be a DID resolver.
Yeah. So embedded so that and so that actually leads to my next question is because I was trying to think of a situation where um, I'm writing an application, but potentially I'm using more than one type of did. I would think if I'm writing an application, I'm probably only using one specific did method. But do you see in the wild any use cases for applications that might use support multiple did formats or did mechanisms?
Or DID methods, right? Yeah, so that depends a lot on the application, right, and what's being built with DID. So there are definitely use cases and deployments and applications where you indeed just need one DID method, especially if it's let's say some more closed, isolated ecosystem or application where you just have one DID method, and then everything is relatively easy and straightforward. Then you have a DID resolver for that one method. But we also see more and more interest in supporting multiple DID methods in order to achieve interoperability across different use cases and different ecosystems, right? So especially when we look at some verifiable credential applications and digital wallet applications, right? There's a lot of excitement about credentials and wallets now, but different countries, different ecosystems, different industries use different DID methods. But if you want to connect across these borders, then it's likely that you need to support multiple DID methods. So, for example, if we were working a little while ago, we worked on a demonstration where we tried to show how a verifiable credential issued here in the EU, let's say a digital diploma credential that's issued by an Austrian university, for example, into your wallet, and then you want to travel to the US, for example, and apply for a job, and you want to prove that you have a university degree, then a verifier which accepts the credential in the US would want to be able to resolve a European DID method, right? And the other way around, and so there's more and more interest in really global interoperability. And if there are many different DID methods that are being used, then you need a resolver that can resolve them.
So you mentioned wallets, and I definitely see that as one of the important applications for DIDs. And you might not know the answer to this. This might be a wallet question more than a DID question. But would you expect, let's say, if each country has their own wallet, would you expect perhaps that maybe each country also has their own DID method? Or do you think there'll be standardization across, especially the European wallet um, context, because that's where all of the innovation is really getting driven from these days. But I'm just curious. So, do you think each country will have its own DID method for its credentials, or there'll be some commonality there?
There they could have different DID methods, or they could use the same DID method. Maybe one thing I want to point out here is that the DID method identifies different underlying technologies, right? So a DID method is not intended to be used to identify a different country or a different or what is
Yeah,
being identified, right? It doesn't make sense, for example, to create a DID method for identifying dogs, for example, because the DID method is about the technology and not about what is being identified. So if we ask the question whether different countries will have different DID methods, then if they will have different DID methods, it's not because they are different countries, but it's because they are making different technical choices of how they want
of
the
course.
DID method to work. Now, in practice here in the EU, I there's one DID method that's quite popular and well known, which is EPSI. I mentioned that, right? EPSI means European Blockchain Service Infrastructure. That's a project being run for a few years now by the EU Commission, and there are many projects and funding
And just to make a quick pitch for next week's episode, Alan Horvat will be on. I believe
okay.
he's active in that project.
Yeah, he's one of the main architects. He can tell you everything about it. And there is a process now that's starting in a European standards organization to create a standard for that DID method. So I think that has a good chance of being widely adopted across different European countries. But there are also other DID methods in use in some countries, like in Spain, for example. There is the Alastria network and ecosystem. They have their own DID method. In Germany, there is the ID Union, which is a cooperative organization, and they are running a Hyperledger Indy network. So they're using the Indy method, and so yeah, there's still some diversity, and not just the one DID method that rules them all. Right?
Um, so Glue is a lot of interest in OpenID and OAuth technology. So, and I know OpenID for VC that is using DIDs as a way to identify um, credentials. Um, but I'm wondering, maybe you could unpack a little bit why, if you have any opinion on why you think OpenID decided to support DIDs, and what opportunities maybe the incorporation of DIDs into OpenID for VC opens up for DIDCOM or other types of services.
Okay, so DIDs are, or let me correct you on one thing. DIDs do
Please.
not identify credentials, right? DIDs identify the subjects and the issuers and the verifiers, right? In this classic three-party model where you have an issuer of a credential, then you have a holder, and then you have a verifier. So those participants are identified by DIDs, not the credentials themselves. But yeah, so OpenID for VC, I'm not a top expert on that, but it's a set of new specifications, right? OpenID for verifiable credential issuance, OpenID for verifiable presentations, and SIOP, the self-issued OpenID provider version 2. The reason why they decided to support it, I think, is simply because over the last few years, DIDs have become very popular as a technology, and DIDs have also always had a built-in way of proving control over DIDs, right? Because DIDs are created and managed with cryptographic keys and wallets, right? When you create a DID, you create a key pair, well, most of the time at least. So there's a built-in way of proving control of the identifier, and so it felt natural at some point to try and figure out how you can combine it with OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect, in turn, has for a long time has already had this feature called SIOP, self-issued OpenID provider. So it has already had this concept of authenticating an identity that belongs to you, so without where you are your own IDP, right? To use the OpenID
Yeah,
terminology, and this original version of that SIOP specification was not quite compatible with DITS, but now the SIOP version 2 supports DITS, and the other pieces, the verifiable credential issuance and verifiable presentation, also support DITS in the OpenID protocol. And it's strictly speaking not OpenID Connect, right? But it's a new
true.
profile of Open.
So DIDCOM, as I understand it, is a way for maybe two DID endpoints to talk to each other, um, and um, and so I'm trying to pick apart the connection between DIDCOM and OpenID for VC. Um, but do you see potentially the opportunity for OpenID for VC to bootstrap into a DIDCOM connection? And if you have no idea about DIDCOM, then that's fair too, because I'm just going in all DID directions here. But I'm wondering about DIDCOM seems like one of the potential applications here. Like DIDs are great, and you could use them for a lot of things, but is DIDCOM maybe one of the useful ways we can get utility out of DIDs?
Yeah, I can say a few things about that. So just like I'm not an expert on the OpenID for VC stuff, I'm not such an expert on DITCOM, but yeah, DITCOM is basically a generic message-based protocol for exchanging any kind of messages. It can be used for exchanging credentials, but it can also be used for exchanging text messages or building a decentralized social network, or playing chess or online. So it's a message-based protocol between peers, and every connection and every message is authenticated and encrypted and secured based on dates, right? The big difference between that and OpenID for VC is that in OpenID you always have this asymmetry, right? In OpenID, the interactions are not between peers. Um, to use the OAuth terminology, which OpenID is based on, you always have something like a client and a protected resource and an authorization server, and there's a request from the client and then a response. So it's more transaction based and a bit asymmetrical, looking at the different roles. Whereas in DITCOM, the peers that communicate are completely equal, right? They use the same technical constructs, and they can, every party in a DITCOM connection can fulfill all roles in an equal way. There have been and there continue to be some initiatives to try and combine these two things. I'm not fully up to date on that, but I know that one of the ideas is that while you do an OpenID for VC transaction, I think one of the claims, or one of the fields that you transfer, or that you present, can be a DITCOM service, or a DID from which you can then discover the DITCOM service. So the idea would be that you start with some traditional OpenID based flow, but then what you get in the end is a DITCOM connection that enables a more long-term, ongoing, persistent relationship, right? So OpenID has this transaction-based philosophy, whereas DITCOM is more about persistent relationships and connections, and there are some concrete efforts in DIF, for example, to specify and try that out, how that works.
Yeah, and OpenID, of course, relies heavily on TLS as the overlying trust model versus encrypting each message or each communication. Um, so Danube has built a service called GoDiddy,
Yeah.
and I'm curious if you have any lessons learned. I don't know if it's been how long it's been up. Has it been a year or 2 years? I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about GoDaddy and what surprised you. And was after you built it, was there anything that surprised you about its usage, or what did you learn along the way? And what is GoDaddy also?
It's an interesting question. So yeah, as I mentioned, we are building some components that implement DIDs, that make it possible to work with DIDs. Originally, we started to work on some open source projects. The most well-known ones are called Universal Resolver and Universal Registrar. So these are open source tools that make it possible to resolve many different DID methods, and also to create and manage DIDs across different DID methods. And then we built, as a company, we then built some enterprise grade versions of those same tools, and we built this this platform called GoDaddy, right? So a little bit like GoDaddy, but for DIDs. And yeah, it's a set of tools that make it possible to create and use and resolve DIDs. What lessons have we
Cool,
learned?
not just a website, but also a cool JSON Rust interface, right? So that you can automate and
Yeah,
script these
sure.
command.
There's an API behind that. There are also some analytics and statistics about DIDs, and some search functions, where, for example, you can also look up historical versions of DIDs and DID documents, right? That's an interesting feature of
A
DIDs, that
Wayback Machine for did documents.
something like that. Yes, but this has from the beginning, this has been one of the design goals, one of the main objectives behind DIDs, which is that you can change the DID document. So for example, you can rotate your keys, or you could change your endpoint URL, service endpoints. You could change, for example, your activity pub endpoint, or your DIDCOM endpoint. You can achieve this data portability without changing your identifier, right? So if you rotate your keys, if you change the location of your services, your DID does not change. So your social graph and DIDCOM connections and so on can persist. And yeah, it's also possible to look up that history. This is not supported equally by all DID methods, but in general, this is a feature that we also support at the GoDaddy platform, to look back at earlier versions of a DID.
And were there any surprises along the way in building this, or seeing how people used it? Did people use it like you expected, or um, curious, just what are your insights in operating a service like that? It's very unique.
Yeah, I'm not sure. People have been using it in very different ways. So we have some users who only use it for resolving DIDs. We have some clients who use it for creating and managing DIDs. We also have some people who have their own tools for working with certain DID methods, but then for some DID methods that certain tools don't support, they then use GoDaddy as a fallback for certain DID methods only. And yeah, we've also received quite some questions about querying and statistics and analytics. So we also have a GraphQL endpoint where you can run some more advanced queries against DIDs. But it's been very diverse. I mean, maybe the most interesting lessons have been around around the question if having such a platform, if that doesn't contradict the idea of DIDs, right? Because we're saying DIDs are decentralized identifiers without central authorities and so on. But then there is a platform that provides DIDs as a service. So that has been a bit of a maybe contradiction, but we've learned some good lessons around that. For example, there is a way how you can use GoDaddy for creating and managing deeds without ever revealing and sharing your private key, right? So your key that ultimately controls the deed can stay on your local device on your own environment, and you only use GoDaddy for facilitating operations, but you're not giving up control of the deed, and figuring that out and thinking that through, and thinking about centralize, or thinking about where deed resolving should happen in an architecture. This I would say has been the most interesting part.
Cool. Actually, I have an existential decentralization philosophical question, which I'm saving for the end if we have time. Um, so the title of the episode was "Latest Development in DIDs." What are some of the latest developments? Like what's happening in DID land and what's new?
So what's new is that we have a new DID working group now at W3C, right? So DIDs have been at W3C recommendations for about 2 years now, but there's a new DID working group which is working on some new things. It's going to update the current DID standard, the DID recommendation, and it's also going to standardize DID resolution, right? So DID resolution has been a separate specification that has not yet gone through the standardization process. That's
Okay.
high on the that has a high priority now to standardize the DID resolution process, and to standardize concrete DID methods, right? I mentioned that DID EPSI, there's a process to standardize the DID EPSI method, and there's also a new working group now that's sort of shared between W3C and DIF and some other organizations, where additional concrete DID methods will be standardized. So there's a lot of interest in that now, and as these things are happening, the new standardization efforts, we're also seeing more and more creative uses of DIDs, right? We probably don't have time to go into that in detail, but they're not just DIDs. There's also this thing called DID URLs, where you have a DID with a path added after the DID and a query string. So it looks a little bit more like a traditional web URL, which we talked about in the beginning. And there's a lot of innovation now happening on how that works and what you can do with that, and what kind of features that can enable moving beyond just the DID and the DID document, but trying to apply that also to some other identifier structures.
And yeah, I was going to ask you about some of the most important applications. What type of applications are driving that particular use case, though? The ability, it sounds like we're saying, okay, now we have the ability to identify something. Can we do this method with this path and these parameters? Is it really going to the HTTP layer? And what sector is driving that? Is it the wallet sector?
It's not going to the HTTP layer. So when we're adding a path and a query string with parameters to a DID, then we get something that we call a DID URL. But how that is, and now we're not saying that we are resolving that. We're talking about dereferencing that. When we dereference that, it doesn't mean that there's an HTTP interaction anywhere. It's still completely up to the DID method how to then dereference that and get something back from that identifier. And one reason why, or one way which this is being used is for identifying some other data structures that you need maybe for verifiable credentials. So for identifying, let's see, schemas or revocation lists or metadata about credentials, right? So that's what I meant. You're now moving away from or beyond just returning a DID document, but you can return other things, like I said, schemas or definitions, or other things. There are also efforts to build trust models and trust frameworks around that. So to build trust registries based on DIDs and DID URLs.
Um, So now I'll ask you my existential decentralization question. This stuff is actually like pretty hard for normal people who don't touch the technology. Normal people rely on the platform providers like Google, Apple, and Microsoft to really figure a lot of this stuff out and make it usable. So whereas the intent maybe of the original design was to decouple, let's say, an identifier from DNS and from the network and from, um, but ultimately, I don't know that decentralization actually is feasible for the technology to end up being widely used in the world. So I guess I'm wondering is, do you think that the end space that we'll get to with DIDs will just maybe be a better way to operate in a centralized world with some new tools and 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 will that become the prevalent perhaps use case for this technology?
I don't know, to be honest. I understand your question, and a lot of the projects and initiatives that are happening now are maybe not fully living up to this original purist ideology, right? The radical self-sovereign identity philosophy, where you control your own identifier and nobody can take it away from you. The real life concrete projects that are happening now probably don't quite do it like that. So even if you use DITs in some of the wallet initiatives that are happening, then there are still some of the traditional central authorities and intermediaries and so on. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. I guess what I'm saying is that there are some gray areas or some hybrid approaches where you use DITs, where DITs are being used, and DITs are not only being used for this original purist ideology, but also because some practical technical features, and then DITs will be used and deployed also in systems that are not completely decentralized. So I'm not sure if that answers. Probably doesn't answer the
Yeah.
the existential question, but
Nobody
there's
has a
there's there's a there's a spectrum, right? There will always be a spectrum because very decentralized, and DITs fit in a number of different ways.
yeah. Yeah, no one has a crystal ball, so it's not a realistic question to say what will happen in the future. Who knows? That's the one thing we've learned over the years is who knows. Um, cool. Well, we try and keep these things to 45 minutes. We're hitting right up against that edge right now, so I guess we'll have to go to last thoughts. Any last thoughts that you want to share with us before we close?
Mm, Not really. Take a look at DIF. Let me advertise Decentralized Identity Foundation if you're interested in DITs or decentralized identity in general. There are not just DITs. There are also a lot of things that build on top of DITs. Decentralized web nodes, DITCOM, decentralized social networks. If you want to work on any of these things, then DIF is a good place for that.
Awesome. All right, Marcus. Well, thank you for joining us today. Maybe at some point we'll actually get Drummond, and we can do a repeat. I actually wanted to see to make a note about an XDI, um, getting the old XDI van back together again, but Drummond
Yeah.
wasn't there. So but most of our audience probably doesn't know what that is, but that's an older standard that we worked on literally like 14 years ago. Um, and anyway, thank you, Marcus, for joining us. It's great to see you. We'll see you at Internet Identity Workshop in about 2.5 weeks or so. And thank you, audience, for joining us. I did actually, there's some chat. So quick reminder for the audience, don't forget to follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. We get special privileges on LinkedIn if we can get to 1K followers. And anyone interested in Internet Identity Workshop, it's not too late to get tickets. If you want to dive in and meet a lot of people in the industry, it's a great event. Happens twice a year. So with that, thank you, audience. Thank you, Mark.